Everybody, welcome to the Fire It Up with CJ show. Today we have Val Walker here talking about her book, 400 Friends and No One to Call, Breaking Through Isolation and Building Community. So welcome, Val.
Hello, great to be here.
So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your take on COVID-19 and how this is actually affecting um, isolation and what you've heard from other people and um, your thoughts on it.
Well, as far as what I'm hearing right now, and this isn't the part in my book, but what's going on right now is people are telling me they're getting calls from people they haven't heard from in 10 or 20 years. They're being rediscovered. A lot of people are also calling their long lost cousins and classmates. And so there's a lot of connecting going on to previous relationships in our lives. A lot of that going on, which is actually a wonderful way to build a community too, because a lot of those people may have affiliations and connections. They may live far from you and haven't talked to them in 10 years. They may know all kinds of things you don't know anymore.
Yeah, so that's actually a positive out, and I think that that has been a
One of them.
silver lining
Yeah.
of potentially just having so much isolation and not knowing what to do. How about for folks that were already isolated to before the pandemic? Is it any
Yeah.
difference for them?
Yes, it is. It's harder for them. This COVID crisis is bringing out the side of people that were more isolated or feeling even more magnified isolation. And people who were pretty fortunate to have built a support system are really getting a lot of bang out of that.
Mm,
So it's really showing up the people who were isolated.
mm,
But it's really important for me in this discussion, I make a difference between what isolation means and loneliness means. So isolation is actually a lack of contact. So for example, if you have a disability or a serious illness, you can't get out and do things, and maybe you're limited in your ability to have time to talk to people. You might be so tired you can only handle talking to people for 1 hour a day. Talk to anybody who's had a serious illness and they want to see people, but they're just too wiped out. That's an actual case of isolation because the illness is isolating them. It's not just about them. And there are many other forces in our life that can isolate us like that. It can be financial, terrible financial problems. Being in survival mode can isolate us where we don't have any time. People are on the back burner of our life because we're just trying to get by each day. Or we might be isolated because we're full-time caregivers and taking care of people who need us a lot, so we have no time, free time to connect with others. So some of the most isolated groups, it's very surprising, are caregivers, people with illnesses, people with disabilities, people who have transportation and language barriers, people who have social stigma barriers, possibly people dealing with types of social stigma around mental illness, or people who LGBTQ community people. There are lots of societal and economic forces and situational forces for being isolated. And I got into a big discussion with you on that because being lonely is really quite different. Lonely is when you perceive that you're isolated, but you still might have good contacts. So you may be close to your husband or you may have good friends or family around, but there are going to be times you might feel extra lonely. What's causing that? It's called perceived isolation in all the social science. So maybe there's something in yourself that you're ashamed of. Maybe there's an isolating situation going on in your family where it just doesn't feel safe or comfortable talking with a family member about problems you have. So you can be lonely and it can you can be isolated in a sense of loneliness, and it's often an internal reaction to a situation, but isolation can be a force outside of you too. So I hope that makes it clear.
Yeah, so in terms of isolation, which is that there's physical reasons and mostly physical reasons that you can't actually have contact with people.
Now with COVID.
Right. So that's an isolation. And so what I'm hearing you say is that, for some people, they are able to like reconnect with friends and hearing from people that they haven't heard about. Is that true for, other people, or is that the vast majority, or I don't really know what, I mean, I can tell
No.
you, at least with me, I
Well, I'll
heard.
tell you, it magnifies already an epidemic of loneliness and isolation in the United States. So let me just throw out some really well evidenced studies. 2 out of 5 Americans, according to the National Institute of Health, say that they actually don't have anybody they can talk to about a problem or something they feel vulnerable about. They can't show it to somebody. So 2 out of 5 Americans say that. And that figure has gone up 3 times since 1985. It used to be much less often that we had no one we could talk to about a real personal or vulnerable kind of thing, or a worry that we had, or a feeling that we had. Now 2 out of 5 Americans say they don't have a person they can go to for that.
And what's the reason?
Yeah, that's a big,
Yeah,
yeah.
so what's the reason for that? Why can't people find other people to share? Is it that we're just too busy running around with our computers and social media, or what's the is there a reason for why that's happening?
There are a lot of different reasons. I'll name some of the biggest reasons. With social media and our digital conversation and connection patterns that we have, there is less time generally for deeper, longer conversations. In other words, you always feel like it's a bad time. It's like, ah, it's like you have to practically get a golden seal of invitation, like this is a good time to call and we will have a nice long talk. So up to pre-COVID, there were many forces in our society that were interrupting, distracting, and fragmenting conversation. There's great evidence. I quote Sherry Turkle, fantastic, wrote the book called Reclaiming Conversation. And there's a lot of study from the Pew Research Center. She's teaches at MIT, but she shows how even the slightest distraction on a phone when you're talking to somebody will thwart the conversation, where you will adapt and change it. You were about to say something, you were about to get into something, you were about to open up your heart about something, but if someone picks up that phone, it'll change the way you communicate. And 83% of women over 40 in the Pew Research, I'm over, if you're middle aged or even older, like a boomer, you're more likely to be even more upset when somebody picks up that phone. There's a lot more tolerance for it with the younger folks, but even 60% of them don't like it either.
Hmm.
So that's not the only reason, but at least in my book, I wanted to look at the way social media and our digital age had made our conversations make us feel lonely. We
Hmm.
sort of, not only FOMO of feeling left out with what everybody else is doing, but a sense of FOMO of, am I important enough to talk to for more than 5 minutes? Like, can we get into something really like a heart to heart? And there's a lot of science that if people don't have meaningful conversation that's more from the heart, that's a real conversation, and a lot on social media when you're posting things, for most people, many studies say it's kind of like superficial. It works for a while, but it doesn't have that deep fulfillment. And that may be tolerable day to day, but it creeps up on us. A Cigna study shows that 53% of Americans say they do not have a deep, meaningful conversation every day. That it's actually getting to be maybe every 2 or 3 days you might be lucky to have something where you really open up and talk from your heart, or talk about something more deeper and meaningful. But
Hmm.
most of the time we go through the day, we might have lots of little conversations, but for many of us that can actually make us feel lonely. But I'm not saying it's the cause, but it all aggravates. If you're already feeling lonely, it's going to make you feel even lonelier.
Hmm.
And there's a huge study from John Cacioppo, who he's written much on loneliness. He actually says that if you already were feeling lonely for whatever reason in your life, left out, different, stigmatized as shame, avoidant, if you already had issues around loneliness, actually you were going to be more sensitive to the littlest slight from a person. You're not going to have the tolerance. So when you try to reach out to someone and reconnect, you're not going to put up with a little bit of a slight or an insensitive thing from somebody. You're going to be hurt much easier.
Mm,
So it's a downward spiral. The more lonely you get, the more sensitive we get to each other, and then we start to kind of give up and just fall back on kind of hiding behind our social media. Does that make sense? It's like you put
yeah,
yourself out there. It's hard to do that. So
yeah.
thanks for letting me explain that, because it's not, I don't want to be like a quick fix on these things. They're pretty complicated.
Mm. Okay, so we've been talking to Val Walker about her book, 400 Friends and No One to Call, and talking about the difference between isolation and loneliness. One of which is a perception of being isolated, and one is truly being isolated for whatever reasons. And that one of the primary reasons from one of the surveys is that people don't have meaningful conversations. They have to wait 2 or 3 days to have a meaningful conversation, and which you're defining meaningful conversation as opening your heart, and I think having a deeper conversation about how you're really doing versus a
Yeah.
Facebook kind of post.
And even not necessarily touchy-feely emotional, but about something serious, a substantial conversation. It might all not necessarily be from the heart. I want to make sure people understand I meant something that's really genuine and substantial, like something you're really thinking about or worried about or motivated about, something that's driving you.
Right.
If you can't talk to somebody about something that's really kind of keeping you going or causing barriers in your life, something that's affecting how you're functioning, it's really hard to talk to people about problems and worries. And right now, a lot of us feel like, well, we don't want to be a burden because everybody's dealing with so much with this COVID thing. So a lot of us, you're seeing all kinds of reactions to this, and a lot of it is grief, a lot of it is anxiety, depression. It's a really hard thing for most human beings right now around the world to deal with, because the uncertainty is terrible. We can't see ahead. So all of our normal patterns of how to comfort each other and things that we typically say to each other, it might not apply because this is all so new. You can't just say, "Oh, you'll be fine in a month," or "You'll find a job. You don't worry, it's going to work out just fine." We can't really say that.
Mm.
So there's a great deal of anxiety now.
And I want in the next segments, let's talk about how we can actually comfort each other in the state of the unknown.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we've been talking to Val Walker about her book, 400 Friends and No One to Call. Thank you so much.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. I would love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.